Welcome to Premise Podcast. This is your host, Angelo Sophocleus. In this episode, I host Dr. Giovanni Gaetani. Giovanni holds a PhD in philosophy on the philosophy of Albert Camus. We talk about Camus' works, The Stranger and the Myth of Sisyphus, and others, and we analyze their central themes, such as death, suicide, absurdity, and rebellion. We discuss how Camus suggested we deal with the meaninglessness of life, and we expand on what Camus meant with phrases such as, "There is but one serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide." Welcome everyone to this episode of Premise Podcast. Today with me I have Giovanni Gaetani. Giovanni is the Growth and Development Officer of Humanists International since January 2017. He has a PhD in philosophy from Rome Tor Vergata University with a thesis entitled "If You Want to Be a Philosopher, Write Novels: The Philosophy of Albert Camus." He has published more than 30 academic papers in English, French, and Italian on the philosophy of Camus and Nietzsche, as well as on secularism and liberalism. He's also the social media manager of the International Society for Camusian Studies, and in 2018 he published his first book in Italian on the philosophy of atheism, and since 2019 he runs a blog called Ad Altezza d'Uomo, aiming to spread the humanist philosophy in Italy. Giovanni, welcome to Premise Podcast.
Thank you, Angelos, and congratulations for your Italian pronunciation, which is perfect. And it's a pleasure to be here and to speak about Camus and philosophy. It's been a long time since the last time I did it, so I'm really happy to be here.
Pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
So a few years ago when I started reading Camus, I started with reading The Stranger, and I was impressed and surprised by the bluntness of the main character, Meursault, and how raw he is in his approach towards life. In particular, Camus starts the novel with the sentence, "My mother died today," or maybe yesterday. So what does Meursault's raw honesty and bluntness say about his character and Camus' approach in general about life? Because I think this very sentence, this very approach reflects Camus' whole approach to life.
Well, first of all, to understand The Stranger, we should know what Camus published before it. The Stranger, as well as The Myth of Sisyphus, were both published in France by Gallimard in 1942, but the very first book of Camus was called The Right Side and the Wrong Side. It was published in 1937 in Algeria by a small publisher, and that's the real starting point in Camus' philosophy, worldview. And in that book, Camus explains that the starting point for himself, but in general for mankind, is what he calls the Mediterranean spirit, la Méditerranité. This is the condition where mankind lives in harmony with nature and the natural elements. And it's a condition where there's a sort of equilibrium between the life of human beings and natural elements like sun, the sea, and everything that you can find in the Algeria of Camus. Now, the character of Meursault, the protagonist of The Stranger, lives at the beginning in this kind of harmony with nature, but it's not like an idyllic harmony. It's not like a poetic harmony. It's basically a condition where there's no philosophy, no morality, no existential questions, and you don't have like a self-awareness of what you're doing and why you're doing it. And indeed, what really strikes about Meursault is this kind of indifference. You call it anomie, but it's true that Morceau is not immoral. He is maybe without moral. He is amoral. But to be honest with Camus, he always said that Morceau wasn't an example to follow. In particular, in the foreword to the first edition for the US of The Stranger, Camus said, when I thought about Morceau, I didn't want to create an example to follow, an ethical character. It is simply a character like many others, and I don't identify myself with it because this is a commonplace. The fact that the character of an author overlaps with the author himself. Well, Camus didn't want it. Camus doesn't is not Morceau, but he said, let's see what happens to a character like Morceau that was living in a natural harmony, but then some sudden events, like the death of his mother and the killing of the Arabs on the beach, what happens when these events break that equilibrium? So, from my point of view, we can understand the stranger as the moment of self-realization when human beings realize that world in itself has no meaning, life is absurd, and we have lived all along for a long time without this awareness, but then we realize this brutal truth.
Mhm. So we see this in Meursault. He does not act immorally, but acts maybe in a way in which society doesn't expect him to behave. Um,
Mm-hmm.
for example, he does not really care about his mother's death. Even at her funeral, he smokes and drinks coffee in front of her coffin. Then there is the murder of the Arabs at the beach.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see towards the end of the novel is that society condemns him for that. And
Mm-hmm.
perhaps this is something we can see in everyday life too, that society condemns those who do not act as society expects them to act.
Exactly. When Camus talks about étrangeté, which is being stranger, he does it in three ways, on three levels. The first one is the étrangeté on a metaphysical level, the fact that human being and world are two separate entities, and there's no real connection between them. The world is not made for human beings and vice versa. Human beings are rather adapting to the world, but there's also another kind of étrangeté, is the idea that we are stranger to our own language, and that whatever we do to communicate with others is not perfect, and there's a lot of misunderstanding every second of our life. And indeed, Camus wrote a drama called The Misunderstanding, Le Malentendu. But then the third kind of étrangeté is what you said, the political, moral difference with others. And society often condemns those strangers that doesn't adapt to the standards of life, the standards of morality. Morceau is one of them. The strange thing is that all the events in the first part of The Stranger of the novel are not immoral in itself. I mean, Morceau went to the funeral of the mother, and she didn't want to look her before she was buried. She didn't want to, he didn't want to look her in the face, and this was, I mean, okay, you're not forced to do it. Then she smoked during the night aside the body of her mother, and that's okay too. Then the day after the funeral of the mother, she had sex with Maria, his girlfriend, and that's fine too. But in the second part of the novel, during the trial, all these events are linked together to show that Morceau is a moral monster, that Morceau deserved the death penalty, not because he killed an Arab on the beach, which is a crime, okay? But because the jury is convinced that also all the events that I mentioned are a crime in itself. And there's this sentence in the novel where Rousseau says, not crying during the funeral of one's mother, it's considered a crime. I was condemned because of this. And we see it every day. Society is in itself a monster when it condemns people that doesn't think in that way. So yeah, this is a good way to read The Stranger.
And also in this novel, we see that Meursault is a rebel. But in some sense, we would say that he's a rebel because he behaves in a way in which society does not expect him to behave. He acts against the norms of society. But do you think he realizes that he's a rebel? Because, in my view, he just continues his life as normal. He does not actively act
Mhm.
rebelliously towards what is happening in in his life. So, do
Mhm.
you think he's a rebel in the sense that he is active, or he's a rebel because he acts against what society expects him?
Well, he's a rebel just in the end of the novel when he refused to be blessed by the priest in the prison. But for the whole for the whole text in the novel is totally passive. He is not a rebel. He might be a stranger, okay, because he's strange and he's also an outsider, but he's not active in any way. He is really passive. He accepts everything. There's a passage where Maria, his girlfriend, says, "Do you want to marry me?" And he says, "Okay, if you want, we can marry." And then she says, "But do you love me?" I believe so. So he's totally passive. And also during the trial, he doesn't say anything to justify himself or to free himself from prison. He could have done it by crying, repenting, um, kneeling in front of the crucifix, like the judge uh, tried to say to him, but he didn't do it. He's totally passive. The only moment where he actually rebels against society is at the end, where when the priest says, if you kneel in front of Jesus Christ, you can be blessed and you can save your soul. That's the only moment where he actually rebels against society. And that's the most important part of the Stranger, because it's the moment where Morso realizes the absurdity of life. There's this sentence that says, "I opened myself to the sweet indifference of the world." And that's the real connection with the myth of Sisyphus. Because for the whole novel, Morceau was passive and basically living a amoral life. At the end, he has this internal rebellion where he says, "Yes, life has no meaning, but it's not the priest that can save me. We are all damned, doomed to despair, but my truth is as important as the one of the priest, or maybe even more." And he realized at that moment the absurdity of life.
Hmm. And staying on the topic of rebellion, he has
Mhm.
a very famous saying, "I rebel, therefore we exist."
Hmm.
Um, what what does he mean with this exactly? How does my rebellion means that we all, as a humankind,
Mhm.
we exist?
Well, to understand that sentence, we should talk about first the myth of Sisyphus, because between The Stranger and The Rebel, which is a book published by Camus in 1952, there are 10 years of the Second World War. And no, not 10 years of war, but I mean, there's the war, the post-war, and there's a whole development of Camus philosophy. Uh, we saw Morceau at the end of the novel. Mm. discovering the absurdity of life. And in the Myth of Sisyphus, Camus focuses on the absurd. The absurd in Camus, it's something similar to the nausea of Sartre. Basically, is that feeling of being stranger to the world, and the fact that the world in itself has no meaning, even though we are mankind keeps asking for a meaning. So basically, the absurd is the contrast between the silence of the world and the continuous questioning of mankind. Well, according to Camus, there are three ways to get out of this impasse, of this blind alley. One is to commit suicide because you think there's no meaning in life and then you commit suicide. Another one is committing philosophical suicide. Philosophical suicide means you recognize that life has no meaning, but then you you turn this meaningless of life in a sort of deity of God, and you build a philosophy of transcendence. So basically, all religious worldview, but also all metaphysical, mystical philosophy are sort of philosophical suicides. Then the third way to escape from the absurdity of life is to rebel against it. It doesn't mean that you are going to change the ontological situation, but it means that at least as a human being, you're going to say, I rebel against this absurdity of life, and I try to build in the absurdity itself a meaning, which is relative, which is precarious, which is it's human. It's a human meaning, but still it's a meaning, and that's the example of Sisyphus, which, despite the meaningless of his effort, keeps pushing the rock on top of the mountain, even though he's going to fall for the eternity. But that's also the whole meaning of the book, The Rebel. You said, what's the meaning of the word of the sentence? I rebel, therefore we exist. It is actually the passage from the solipsism of Sisyphus, but also the solipsism of Morceau, to a more collective condition where, yes, you rebel to absurdity alone, but you do it in name of something called human nature. Camus always thought that all human beings share something which is really hard to define, and he called him human nature. So in this sense, you have to read the sentence, I rebel, therefore I exist. We exist, sorry. I am alone, but everyone is alone in their rebellion. Therefore, we can all rebel together and build up a human meaning in the absurdity.
Mm-hmm.
Was it clear?
Yes, was very
Okay,
clear. And
thank
it
you.
was good that you mentioned the myth of Sisyphus and the three ways that Camus says we can escape this realization that life has no meaning. And I believe we can see all three of them in the myth of Sisyphus. First, as you said, we have suicide, someone actually committing suicide, and that, according to Camus, and according to the first sentence again of the myth of Sisyphus, where he says, there is but one truly serious philosophical question, and that is suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he poses a question as to why don't we commit suicide when we realize that life has no meaning?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then you mentioned philosophical suicide, and
Mm-hmm.
perhaps we can see this in Sisyphus, in this endless and meaningless task that he
Mm-hmm.
has been condemned by the gods to do. Just roll a boulder up a hill, and then the boulder falls, and then he has to do it again for eternity. But then Sisyphus has to find some meaning, as you said, in the human condition, in the human nature of rolling the rock up the hill, even if it's a meaningless task. So, do you think this is a good way to put it, that what Sisyphus does and how he copes with it reflects the modern way of life, or the everyday way of life?
I mean, in a way or another, we are all Sisyphus in our everyday life. Yes, Sisyphus is a mythological character, and there are a lot of differences between him and us. For example, life of Sisyphus is eternal. Eternal is also is punishment. While we are mortal, we will die sooner or later. So our uh, effort is not endless; it has an end. So, but Camus says at the end of the Myth of Sisyphus that the wisdom of Sisyphus is that despite the meaningless of life and despite the absurdity of his punishment, he keeps rolling the rock on top of the mountain, and he does it also sometimes being happy. So the very last sentence of the Myth of Sisyphus, one should imagine Sisyphus happy, or one must imagine Sisyphus happy. In French, the word is il faut, which is really hard to translate in English and any other language. You have to read it in this way. Uh, the, the, the condition of Sisyphus is unfortunate, but there's still a chance that Sisyphus can be happy in absurdity. So there's also another sentence that is less known from Camus. Is, I don't know how to say, is the subtitle that he chose for the Myth of Sisyphus. It was Sisyphus or the Happiness in Hell. It was meant to be in the first edition of the Myth of Sisyphus in the wrapper of the book, but then Gallimard, the editor, said he wouldn't do it. Anyway, Sisyphus or the happiness at the hell means that, yes, we are all in hell, we are all living in absurdity and in nihilism, but still we can find happiness within this absurdity of life. Camus is not willing to replace absurdity with religion or any other mystical or transcendental worldview, because he thinks this is cheating, this is committing philosophical suicide. But at the same time, he knows how hard to be happy within nihilism can be. That's why, rather than focusing on what is true, at the beginning of the Myth of Sisyphus, he talks about meaning of life. Meaning of life can be different for everyone, while truth can be, it has to be the same for everyone. Is not really interested in truth in the Myth of Sisyphus, because he knows that the only truth that is the same for everyone is nihilism, the meaningless of life. But he is focused on the meaning that every small Sisyphus like us can give to his own life.
One quote by Camus, which reflects what you said about how humans realize this meaninglessness of life. He says, describing the everyday life, it happens that the stage sets collapse. Rising, streetcar, 4 hours in the office or the factory, meal, streetcar, 4 hours of work, meal, sleep, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, according to the same rhythm. The path is easily followed most of the time, but one day the why arises, and everything begins in that weariness thing with amazement. And I do think that everyone has at some point in their lives, begin to ponder about the meaninglessness of everything and how life has no inherent meaning. And I could say that most people commit philosophical suicide or cheating, as can you very well put it. And this seems to be the easy way out, right? Creating a religion or a belief system, or just finding a football team to support or devote yourself to something. That's a way to escape this realization of meaninglessness, because even if doing one task for the rest of eternity seems horrible, as Sisyphus did, we do realize that we might do one task for the rest of our lives, but we somehow block the realization that this is meaningless, and we substitute the meaninglessness, or we fill the meaninglessness, with religions, belief systems, and teams or causes. Would you say that this is something that Camus believed, or this is what he tried to show through the myth of Sisyphus?
Yes, I mean, the myth of Sisyphus can be considered an experiment. It can be considered a philosophical experiment. At the beginning of the book, he says, what happens if we try to live without any appeal to transcendence? And what happens when we try to not cheat and try to stay within the contradiction and the absurdity of life without wanting to surpass it and cheat? He thinks, yes, that all religions and all uh, secular religions as well, like you mentioned sports and you mentioned also other causes, in some ways they are all cheating, because basically what you're trying to say is that what you defined before meaningless has instead a meaning in itself. Religion is the perfect example. Religion is the effort to give meaning to the meaningless, and to think that everything that happens in this world has a reason, has an higher reason, which you call the will of God. Well, Camus says you were calling this absurdity. Right now you call it the will of God. And this is cheating, because you have been not loyal to your own premises. You have been not loyal to your own reasoning. And it shows that a lot of philosophers in contemporary and modern philosophy did cheat. For example, he loves Kierkegaard, he loves also Pascal, and he loves also Chestov, another philosopher that believe in God. And you see always the same pattern in these philosophies. They start from the realization of how terrible life is in itself, how meaningless life itself it is in itself. But then they say, yes, life is meaningless, but God will save us.
Mhm.
And the only thing you have to do is a leap of faith. This is a perfect example. He says life is surrounded by absurd walls. What you have to do is not to live within these walls, but simply find the way to jump over these walls. And this is called the leap of faith. Basically, you are escaping world, you're trying to find a meaning to the world in a afterlife, because this is what all religions do. They basically say, okay, this life is terrible, is suffering, is sacrifice, but all this suffering, absurdity, and sacrifice will be compensated in an afterlife. Well, Camus says it very clearly, this is cheating. And what he admires about Sisyphus is that despite this condition, he doesn't give up, nor he kneels himself in front of God to beg for forgiveness by the gods themselves. So, uh, but as you said, there are many other ways to cheat. You mentioned sports, and from my point of view, many ways of supporting your football team, or I don't know, your political party as well. They are way of cheating, because basically you think that this could be the absolute truth that makes life meaningful, but it's just a way to distract yourself from the fact that life has no meaning. I'm not saying that we have to be like the character of the nausea of Sartre, Antoine Roquentin, that thinks about this sentiment of nausea every time. But we need to be aware that life at the bottom is always meaningless. But as I said, we don't have to surrender to this absurdity of life. And this is, I think, the core of Camus philosophy, to not surrender to absurdity of life and to find a way to live altogether within absurdity. And this is called the revolt, la révolte
Mhm.
in Camus.
So, given what you have said about Sisyphus, how do you think we can compare Sisyphus and Meursault? At what point in The Stranger
Mhm.
does Meursault act in the same way as Sisyphus? Is it when Meursault is passive?
Mhm.
Is it when he rebels?
Mhm.
I would think if it's when he's passive, if I would bring that to the case of Sisyphus,
Mhm.
Sisyphus would be passive about rolling the rock up the hill. He would be like, okay, whatever, I don't care.
Mhm.
I won't bother over this. It's not worth it. Feeling bad about rolling the rock up and down the hill. Or does Sisyphus rebel at rolling the rock up and
Mhm.
down up the hill, as Meursault does at the end of The Stranger?
I think it's really hard to compare the two characters, but if any comparison can be made, it's just between the last Morceau and Sisyphus, because, as I said, Morceau is totally passive from the beginning to the end, and the only moment he rebels against society is at the end when he rebels against the priest. And Sisyphus himself has a sort of passivity, yes, but he is aware of this. Camus says it really clearly at the end of the book. Uh, the the effort of Sisyphus is tragic because he is aware of his punishment. He is aware of his condition and is aware that his effort will be endless. Morceau doesn't know it at the beginning. Morceau is just played. Camus says Morceau plays a game without knowing it, and this game is the game of society. So he tries to adapt to what other people says. He never has a will, an autonomous will. So I think it's really hard to compare them. But if we want to compare them, it's just in this way. The only second where Morceau resembles Sisyphus is at the end of the book.
Mhm. And perhaps another thing that's surprising about the myth of Sisyphus is that even though Sisyphus is condemned to do an endless and meaningless task for eternity, and then this is related, and then Camus relates it to the modern way of life, which is repetitive and meaningless, despite the fact that Sisyphus does a meaningless task. It seems that Camus thinks that he emerges victorious from all this. Um, I will mention two quotes from the book.
Mhm.
So Camus mentions the awareness that was to constitute his torture at the same time crowns his victory. And also, when he leaves the heights and gradually sinks towards the layers of the gods, he is superior to his fate. He is stronger than his rock. It seems like a contradiction to someone who reads the Myth of Sisyphus for the first time, maybe, um, because we cannot conform by the last sentence of the book. We cannot imagine Sisyphus
Mhm.
happy. But at the same time, Camus says that he's stronger than his rock. He's stronger than the meaningless task which he does.
Mhm.
Um, how does Camus thinks that Sisyphus emerges victorious from this?
Well, victorious, it seems like not the right word, because in the end, the last word always belongs to the absurdity. Even after the rebellion and even after the rebels, the book, the last word is always on belongs to absurdity. Uh, the funny thing is that the last sentence, one must should imagine Sisyphus happy. It's it's like an invitation for us to imagine ourselves happy. So it's a task rather than affirmation. It's not saying Sisyphus is happy. It's saying Sisyphus can be happy and we should imagine him happy. It's not like a matter of fact. It's not saying, oh, we are all happy, nihilism is nothing, and absurdity is something too easy to overcome. It's not like this. Camus is saying, even though absurdity is so strong and so hard to bear, we can keep pushing it up to the hill and maybe find at the end of this effort and during this effort a sort of happiness. Uh, One of the critique towards Camus is that he was pessimistic. I would say it wasn't pessimistic, it was the opposite. It was rather optimistic about what mankind can achieve if it is aware of its struggle and if it's aware of its condition. But it is true that at the end, absurdity of life will stay where it is. The whole effort of mankind is not to replace absurdity with meaning, is to build meaning on absurdity and into absurdity. So I wouldn't agree saying that Sisyphus is victorious, because it seems like he, he won against absurdity, but rather is simply facing absurdity in an eternal, endless effort, which is our own effort, because every day we are exactly like Sisyphus. Every day, without realizing or not, we are pushing our rock at the top of the mountain. It will fall overnight, and the day after, we're going to do the same every day. So, but we are not victorious because there's no final word. We keep doing the same effort every day, but there's no victory. There's no definitive victory. Um, Another marvelous book of Camus is La Peste, The Plague, which is my favorite book, by the way, of all time. And one thing that keeps coming back is the idea that we need to start everything over and over again. The fight against the plague can be uh, ended at some point, but the plague will come back. And this is the same with the Rock of Sisyphus. There's a comparison to be made between the Rock of Sisyphus and the presence of the plague.
So to better understand how
Mhm.
Camus suggests that we should deal with our own rock, because everyone has their own rock that they roll up the hill. Could we refer to the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre and Viktor Frankl? I refer specifically to Sartre's quote that existence precedes essence. We understand that life by itself has no meaning, and then we create some meaning, or as you said, we build meaning. We build the essence upon the meaninglessness. And then referring to Viktor Frankl, who was at concentration camp and faced with all the torture and struggles and bluntness of life at the concentration camp, he had to create some meaning upon that. He had to find even something to live for. So is Camus' philosophy comparable to what Sartre and Frankl are saying?
Well, you know that Camus and Sartre were intellectual enemies, and also on this point, they were on two opposite sides. Because yes, Sartre says that the existence precedes essence, and he wanted to say that rightfully there's no metaphysical essence in the world, especially talking about human beings, but human beings lives and then they define what is the essence of something. But this has a political implication. This means that there's no human nature, so human beings can be simply manipulated and modeled like plastic, and they can become whatever they are. And this was, for example, the struggle of every totalitarian system which tried to transform human beings and citizens into what they wanted to be, especially in the communist worldview. Human beings needs to be reshaped according to what is right, not according what is human nature. Human nature can be shaped in a way or in another. Well, Camus said at the beginning of the Myth of Sisyphus that while we are not living in a Platonic world where there are essence from the beginning of times, there's still something that unites all human beings, and you cannot deny this. This is called the human nature. This is a really complex concept in Camus because he might be accused of being an essentialist, but instead he's saying that we have to respect this core of feelings and of values within human nature because it's something that we instinctively perceive within ourselves. I don't know very well the philosophy of Viktor Frankl, but you mentioned the Holocaust, you mentioned the concentration camps. Well, a lot of people that went through this agony, this terrible experience, uh, they were reduced to this essential call of human nature. And the evil plan of the Nazis were to remove even this core of human nature from human beings in Auschwitz, Birkenau, and all other concentration camps. Well, Camus saw the concentration camps, saw the World War, saw what human beings are capable of doing. And he said, we need to oppose to this idea of a total plasticity of human beings, an idea of human nature, which is an idea. It's not like something, a substance. It's not something like the essence of Plato. So yes, it's a really complicated question, and even if I've studied Camus for a long time, I still think that on this subject there's a lot to say and a lot to criticize, because Camus wasn't that clear from a philosophical point of view, and yet I I think there's a positive message to collect here rather than to dismiss.
Can we bring everything we've said under the act of rebellion, and therefore, according to Camus, confirm our existence? Um, and I'm mentioning specifically the cycle of rebellion in in Camus' work. Can we put everything we've said under the cycle of rebellion? How can we define it, and what what is its significance in Camus' work?
So Camus writes The Rebel in 1952, and this book is a reflection on what happened during the 10 years before, after the publication of the Myth of Sisyphus. And it happened a lot, especially in Europe. There has been the Second World War, the concentration camp, and the establishment of the Cold War. Camus said, we saw that the absurdity of life led to all this tragic heavens. So we need to find together a way to cope with absurdity without killing each other. So the rebel basically is another experiment. If the myth of Sisyphus was an experiment to verify if it's possible to live without any morality, any value, the rebel is an experiment to say, can we build our own values without killing each other? Because the two alternatives in front of the rebel is either to impose his own truth to all other human beings, thinking that is absolute right, and this implies also murder, homicide, and totalitarian regimes, or it is to find a way to keep together all the different views of human beings. And this is a huge task. It's not an easy task. Camus is really realistic about it. He says the revolutionary have an easier task because they basically say, we are right, you don't know anything about the truth of revolution, so you need to be subjugated to our truth. But the rebel of Camus has a way harder task, which is to respect the truth of everyone and still to look for a progress. The end of the rebel, it's a positive message, okay, but to be honest, it's a really, really, really hard task. It says that mankind can master everything that can be mastered in the world. Mankind can repair in the creation everything that can be repaired. But after all this, kids will keep dying with no reason, even in a perfect society. So it's not saying that mankind can fix the world. It's just saying that we can diminish the suffering of each other and the pain and the evil that we do to each other. But at the end, the absurdity will still be there. And yes, this is something that we see in the plague. Camus says, yes, we need to fight the plague, but the plague will always come back. If not the plague, something similar, another disease, another phenomenon that can be compared to the plague. So in conclusion, the message of Camus is not triumphant, is not optimistic in a naive way. It's simply the realization that in the same way that Sisyphus kept struggling and pushing the rock towards the hill of the mountain, the top of the mountain, also the rebel has to keep alive his rebellion. Otherwise, it either will become a murder or it will die within below the burden of his own rock.
This is indeed a very optimistic way to end this conversation.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Giovanni, for your participation in the podcast.
It was my pleasure, Angelos. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
You have just listened to Premise Podcast. Subscribe to Premise Podcast on YouTube and make sure to follow the podcast on Twitter and Facebook. The podcast is also available on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Soundcloud, Stitcher, and Spotify. Please consider supporting Premise Podcast on Patreon to help bring philosophy to the public. See you next week. Thanks for listening.